I watched a company in a meeting with department heads at the FDA tell them, like, I am currently manufacturing treatment in Florida. And again, there was no, oh, well, you better stop. It was just crickets. It was just silence, right? And these were not mid-level people at the FDA. These were very high-level people.
Can you explain what is the right to try and then the expanded access program?
Right to try is a movement that basically asserts that if there are patients who have either exhausted or already considered and decided not to pursue approved treatment, they have exactly what the name sounds like, a right to try.
They have the laws, but they don't have any guidance to guide the industry.
Despite this being an issue for like 12 years, that guidance just doesn't exist, right? So you're going to need to be in a position of having to infer based on the history of behavior what is and is not okay, and you're going to have to make a lot of guesses.
Why do you think they don't want to touch that? Resources, they just don't want to get scrutinized like what you mentioned?
My personal hot take on it is just that every single person who is considering it is like, dude, I'm going to get in so much trouble if I do this. Like, I don't want to touch this. Look, if you work at the FDA, you are a member of what is probably the single most unpopular bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. You mention the FDA, and it's just like a chorus of groans. We were just losing enormous sums of money on this expanded access program. We were doing the right thing, and the market was punishing us for it.
So is QSTAR a solution to this problem?
Yes. So under QSTAR, the FDA and HHS are going to basically say, all right, here is how you can compliantly participate in these state level programs. It's kind of like state level cannabis law. We're not going to come after you. And I asked them, like, okay, you're post phase 1, you're going for full approval. Why did you choose Florida over Utah when Utah is so much easier? And the answer was.
So Steve, thank you for being here today. And I really appreciate, spending, I would probably say we're going to go, an hour or two talking about some really important things here in the United States, which a lot of doctors and even myself, are not aware. A lot of doctors, a lot of patients are not aware of the access that they have to certain unapproved, or as they call experimental drugs in the United States, right? So a lot of people, they have to go overseas, but they have access here in the United States. So that's going to be the entire, most of that. That's going to be the core topic of what Steve is going to be talking about us today. He's at the forefront of what's going on, specifically with right to try and Montana. And I know he's all over, the US and in the front line. So I'm honored to have Steve in here and actually talk to him, ask questions. And if for the audience that's looking here too, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the chat, because I actually do read them. And then as I see fit, I ask him questions as well, right? So I like engaging with the audience as well. So Steve, for those that don't know who you are, tell us a little bit about you, about what you're up to, and, what you're doing with the right to try.
Sure. So my name is Stephen Martin. I'm US lead for a company called Infinita. I was one of the co-authors of Montana SB535, and also like a kind of clone bill up in New Hampshire, which did not pass this last year, but we're thinking will this coming year. So in my role, I primarily work overseeing our commercial rollout in Montana, a lot of talking with biotechs who want to understand how to compliantly use a state level program. In addition to that, over the last kind of 4 or 5 months, a huge amount of my job has involved going to Washington, D.C. and speaking with both policymakers and regulators about both the need to have a clear stance from the federal government towards these state laws, and also trying to clarify what the current stance actually is. Because I think a lot of people who are not familiar with the issue might be surprised to find that you can spend hours and hours and you can talk to a lot of very important people trying to figure out whether the federal government and federal regulators like the FDA actually have a problem with you using a state law. And you will have a very hard time getting a clear answer. This is true both when you speak to them directly and also when you look at their actual history of enforcement. So I think, over time, I've kind of become somewhat of an expert on this odd sort of gray legal area in the interplay between these state level access programs, or what we call QSTARs, Qualified State Therapeutics Access Regimes, and federal regulation. And so I'm happy to come here today, kind of talk about the history of all of that, where things are currently at, and give some of your listeners kind of an inside tack on what our engagements with FDA and HHS have kind of led to in terms of an understanding of how to use these state programs in a compliant fashion.
Awesome. There's that I've seen, there's really no one doing this. So, it's amazing that you're doing this because there are many unanswered questions, right? And
Yes.
I believe that having clarity is very important because if there's clarity, then doctors are going to be confident enough to, you know that what they can and cannot do. Also manufacturers on the manufacturing side and these people that are producing these drugs or biologics, they'll also be confident enough, right? And I have so many questions, but I don't want to. I know it's later on, like as you continue to talk, because you made some great points. I saw an interview that you did previously, and there was some great things that I never thought about it. Like as you were talking, I'm like, damn, that makes sense. So I'm sure you're going to cover it in the presentation, but just go ahead and I don't know what you want to start with.
Sure. I mean, let me just go through some
Yeah.
of the stuff in the deck. I think this is maybe a good place to start, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about the historical timeline for how the FDA and HHS have actually interacted towards these state laws. Now, the one thing that is not on this slide that will be particularly relevant for a stem cell crowd is Regenerative Sciences LLC, it's now Regenix, but they had a case in 2014 where they fought the FDA over using their own stem cell treatments, which were cultured for longer than 24 hours and used an antibiotic that was sourced interstate. Um, and they ultimately lost that fight. Dr. Centeno fought the good fight, but unfortunately did not come out ahead. Right. But noticeably, that was not actually done under a specific Colorado state law, and like allowing for stem cells. So I didn't include it in this slide. So this is more about how the FDA and how HHS have generally behaved towards state level laws, which specifically allow for treatment access, right? So with that said, let's kind of dive into it. 2014, we have Colorado, Governor Hickenlooper passes the first state level right to try bill, right? Now, over the next few years, a lot of states follow suit, most notably Texas. And the reason I say Texas is important is because in 2015, we have probably the single highest profile case of a provider ever using a state law in American history, which was a man by the name of Dr. Del Pasan. Now, he had been conducting a phase 3 trial for a very lethal cancer, and his trial completed, results were good. And at that point, according to federal regulations, he was supposed to cease treatment. But he had 75 patients, actually 78, who he was looking at them and he says, well, if I do that, these people are just going to die, right? These are terminally ill cases. So instead, he used Texas's right to try law to treat them. And then in 2016, he actually went and testified in front of Congress federally to the effect. So not only did he use this state law, he actively put it on the congressional record that he did so, right? And this was a very widely publicized case. It was covered in a lot of large media outlets. It's impossible that the FDA and HHS were not aware of Dr. Del Pasan's activity, right? Now, that same year, Senator Ron Johnson, in 2 different occasions, asked HHS and FDA directly, hey, if you find someone using one of these state laws to provide an unapproved drug to patients, will you enforce federal law against them? He did so in a letter, and then he did so after summoning HHS and FDA representatives in front of Congress. Now, when he summoned the representatives in front of Congress, one of them refused to attend, and the other one, when asked this question, I believe their answer was something like, I can't comment on what enforcement action we might take, right? It was a total, I can't really speak to what enforcement action we might take.
Yeah.
So a total non-answer.
Yep.
And then in the letter, they just refused to answer the letter. So the letter specifically asked this and they never got any questions. Now in 2018, federal right to try passes. And a lot of this state level activity, like what Dr. Del Pasan did, was sort of the onus behind this federal law. Yes, all of these state laws existed. They were clearly being used to save lives, but the unwillingness to actually articulate a stance on these by FDA and HHS led to this kind of chilling effect, where providers did not feel confident using the state laws, and thus Senator Ron Johnson primarily passes the federal law, which Donald Trump signs into law, right? That same year, by the way, Dr. Del Pasan's drug got approved by the FDA, the same drug that he had used to treat patients under Texas right to try a few years earlier. In the years since then, more and more states have continued passing their own laws. These are not only right to try laws like what we saw in 2015, but these are also stem cell laws, like what your audience is probably primarily familiar with. And more recently, it's right to individualized treatment laws, which the Goldwater Institute primarily has passed in about 20 states now. And then we have broadened right to try laws like what we operate under in Montana, and to a lesser extent, what is currently available in New Hampshire as well. So more and more of these states kept on passing, and some of these state laws really did start to see substantial amounts of adoption. Florida and Utah's stem cell markets would be the primary example of this, right?
Yep.
But again, you could look at the actual history of enforcement from the FDA. You would see a lot of warning letters, and you would see that when someone was making misleading claims about their treatment, or if someone had poor manufacturing quality, right, and they were operating under a state law, the state law certainly did not shield them. FDA was more than willing to go after them. But noticeably, since 2014, almost like 12 years now, we couldn't actually find any cases of the FDA or HHS going after a company specifically for using a state law, not while doing poor manufacturing quality, not while making misleading claims, but specifically saying, hey, we don't care that you're compliant. We don't care that your quality is good. We don't care that you're not making misleading claims. And we don't care that you're using the state law. You have to go through us. They've just never actually done that. So earlier this year, myself and a few other stakeholders, one company that's already operating in Florida, a few companies that are planning on coming to Montana, and also the father of a young patient who wants to come get treatment in Montana. We met with several department heads at the FDA and tried to get clarification from them. Like, hey, it's this question was posed to you in 2016 by Senator Ron Johnson. It's still never been answered. What's the deal? Like, we're getting going. We're going to go treat patients under state laws. Some of us are already treating patients under state laws. Do you guys actually have a problem with that? Right? Now, just continuing the previous trend, we could not get a lot of straight answers out of them. All right. But I will say this, I watched a company in a meeting with department heads at the FDA tell them, like, I am currently manufacturing treatment in Florida for use. I am going to do this. And again, there was no, oh, well, you better stop. It was just crickets. It was just silence, right? And these were not mid-level people at the FDA. These were very high-level people. So let me see if I can get to what we do and don't have from the FDA at this point, right? So the first thing we have.
So Stephen, so one thing, sorry to cut you off. I like the saying that a fish doesn't know that it's in water, right? So we know the right to try. We understand that, and I should have asked you before. Can you, before you get into it, can you explain what is the right to try? I know there's another use, compassionate use, or the expanded access as well. And how are they different? Because believe it or not, like, I found out about the right to try, maybe I would say like a year ago. And that was because I was just researching a lot and I got into a big rabbit hole. But other than that, I wouldn't have known. And then I talk about the right to try expanded access, and not a lot of people have heard of it, And so I would like, so like, we know this, right? Because you live in every day, you talk it. So can you kind of explain to us? I know and then I was reading that there's like a couple of different variations of right to try as well. Can you explain briefly on that, and then the expanded access program? Thank you so much.
Sure. For context, everything that I'm talking about here is just federal government stance towards state laws generally. But with that being said, I'm happy to give a little bit of background on right to try and expanded access.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
Yeah. So right to try is a movement that basically asserts that if there are patients, they can be terminally ill or not, but who have either exhausted or already considered and decided not to pursue approved treatment options. So these are things that have gone all the way through the clinical pipeline, been approved by the FDA, and are available. If they have made the informed decision that they want to try something else, they have exactly what the name sounds like, a right to try. Now you have to provide the treatment at cost under federal regulations. You can't make a profit off of doing so. There's other things like depending on what pathway you use, you have to notify the FDA. In the case of right to try specifically, you notify them. You don't seek approval. They have no authority to tell you, no, you can't do that. You just have to keep them informed. But that is the essence of the right to try. Now, in more recent years, there have been variations on this. In Montana, we have no requirement that a patient is terminally ill, whereas most right to try laws on both the federal and state level require that someone is terminally ill or has a life threatening illness. Right. So that's one variation. I would call that broadened right to try. Separately from that, there are now 20 states with something called right to individualized treatment laws. These are laws which allow for people to use treatments which are specifically tailored to their genetic code. There's various reasons why it's kind of physically impossible to take a lot of those treatments through the clinical pipeline that the FDA has currently set up. Basically, in order to do that, you're supposed to have clinical trials that, recruit a lot of people. And you can't really do that when every single treatment is specifically dedicated to a single person, right? So a lot of these state level laws are designed to allow people to access these sort of treatments. And then, there is also the federal system, which is redundant in some senses to a lot of state level right to try laws, but does provide like a clear compliant pathway for these. Now, maybe a topic for another day is that a lot of these existing right to try laws outside of what Montana have done and outside of the more recent individualized treatment laws just haven't seen a lot of adoption. And I did a whole 2-hour interview. I think that's the one you saw, explaining why that's the case, right?
That was a great interview, by the way. That was a great interview.
Well, yeah, I encourage everyone to check it out. It's with the Transhumanist Party of America. Some very, very cool guys. But now that's separate from expanded access. Expanded access is a system which is a lot like right to try, but in some cases more strict and in some cases more flexible. The way it's more strict is with expanded access, you have to go to the FDA and seek approval. And it's an expensive process. And, a lot of companies will just not do that because of the cost of the application, right? But the flip side is you can much more broadly utilize it. It kind of has a similar standard as Montana, where you don't need to prove that something is life-threatening or terminally ill in order to qualify under expanded access. So there's this trade-off of like a little more bureaucratic cost, a little more FDA oversight or like meddling, right? Versus the ability to have a more flexible regime for actually providing pre-approval access. So on a high level, that's expanded access versus right to try. One other factor to consider is that almost universally across all these pathways, with the exception of the individualized treatment stuff, everything has to be post phase 1. So you have to have a phase 1 clinical study showing initial safety data in humans in order to use really any of these pathways. So that's 50,000 foot view what right to try and expanded access are. This presentation I'm giving today is more about how is the federal government looking at state laws generally? And that could be whether it's right to try, right to personalized treatment. It could be the stem cell laws down in Florida, but it all does kind of get bundled together into a single thing when you're considering the federal government's enforcement stance.
Gotcha. Thanks for the explanation. It was awesome.
No problem. Okay, so after our meeting with the FDA, which was, I think, June 18th, this is what we think we can actually say that we have and don't have in terms of using a state law compliantly. What we do have is we have a history of kind of tacit approval. We have a history of the FDA like clearly not holding the use of a state law against providers, as is the case with Dr. Del Passand down in Texas. This was a man who treated 78 patients under a state law. He testified about doing so in front of Congress. And then 2 years after that testimony, his drug got approved, right? That is not That is not what you would expect to see from an agency that categorically does not approve of the use of these state laws, right? Now, on the flip side, we also have a lot of warning letters. FDA has sent a ton of warning letters to stem cell providers specifically, most notably Cellularity, recently down in Florida for their product Interfill. But if you actually look at that fourth bullet point, we've never actually seen any of these warning letters escalate up to enforcement, right? And this is a kind of nuanced point here that I think is important to recognize. There is a huge difference procedurally between the FDA sending a warning letter and actually kicking something up to a court case. The FDA can send a warning letter by itself, and warning letters are just warnings, right? If you ignore one, it does not automatically escalate. It has to then go through a process of getting HHS involved, which is overseen by RFK currently, and then possibly even getting the Department of Justice involved to actually go all the way up to initiating a court case, right? We have not seen for providers using these state laws any of these warning letters escalate to actual legal enforcement when it is solely based on the use of a state law. We have seen some things when it's like misleading claims were being made. But again, that means that the state law context is kind of incidental, not causal, right? And lastly, we have no guidance from the FDA or from HHS on their stance towards these state laws, whether this is right to try, stem cells, whatever. There has never been any sort of official recognition. And as that previous history with Senator Ron Johnson showed, and as our meeting with the FDA showed, they are really reticent to put out any sort of official stance whatsoever. And the reason for that is political. FDA is ultimately, it has to be refunded by Congress every few years. The vast majority of congressional representatives now are from a state that has a state law because it's just become such a popular trend, right? Also, there are various committees like HELP, which have people like Senator Moody and Senator Banks, who are from states that have these laws. Those committees control the funding of the FDA. They control the leadership of the FDA. When, for example, whoever becomes the next FDA commissioner has to get nominated, it will have to go through a vote with HELP first, which will be very tight. Last thing FDA wants to do is have this like kind of sword of Damocles of them going after providers in Florida to any serious degree when they have to try to get some nominee through the process, right? And this is before you consider that, generally speaking, RFK is in favor of stem cell treatments particularly, and President Trump is obviously the man who signed the right to try into law. He's very proud of that achievement. So there is a real difference between the on the books reality of like the letter of the regulations versus how much political will there is to actually enforce against these companies. And I think this is why you can see that like discrepancy between warning letters being abundant, but actual enforcement being pretty much non-existent, right? So before I move on, I'll just pause there. Have you got any questions about that?
Yeah, actually, I do. So thanks. So for the warning letters, yeah, I've seen online, specifically on LinkedIn, that they treat warning letters like it's the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm glad you said that because, I mean, I'm not saying that they're good, right? Obviously. It's just a warning, like, hey, most of because, we're big into like compliant marketing. So most of the things that we see in the warning letters is that they're making marketing claims, right? They're marketing
Yes.
unsubstantiated claims. Remove it from your website, right? They're saying that X cures or helps with X. That's not FDA approved, so you cannot say that, right?
Yeah.
I have seen a lot, right? For the good manufacturing process, something like that. But most of the warning letters that I've seen are mostly marketing language, at least the ones that I've seen, right? And then the no guidance. So what you're pretty much saying here is that the way that I'm interpreting it is the federal and state laws, they don't have a guidance specifically for right to try. Like they have the laws, but they don't have any guidance to guide the industry. Is that what you're saying?
It's not even about right to try. It's about state laws generally, right? Let's say that you're a provider, right? Let's just imagine you're a biotech. You've cleared a phase 1 clinical trial, let's say for a stem cell treatment, right? So you want to use whatever state law. Maybe it's Florida, maybe it's Montana, maybe it's some other place, right? Can you do so compliantly? How
Hmm.
do you do so compliantly? Like, what is the process? What is the notification process? Seems like it's kind of against the letter of a lot of federal regulations. If you do so, would the FDA exercise enforcement discretion? Would they say, well, okay, this is against the letter of the regulations, but we're not going to come after you for it? If you look at the history, it certainly seems that way. But if you were to try to find FDA guidance, these are long documents that the FDA puts out that kind of explains their interpretations of the rules and regulations, lays out best practices for providers. This is what you would normally do. What you will find is, despite this being an issue for like 12 years, that guidance just doesn't exist, right? So
Hmm.
you're going to need to be in a position of having to infer based on the
Hmm.
history of behavior what is and is not okay. And you're going to have to make a lot of guesses. This is
Gotcha.
what I mean when I say that there is no guidance. It is a
Interesting.
legal gray area. And this is why I spend a lot of time talking about the kind of nuances of examining the FDA's behavioral record, because that's the only
Gotcha.
source of information we have.
Got
We
it.
don't have any sort of written document from them. They are extremely hesitant to actually provide any sort of official stance. That's why you get these like non-answers of like whether they'll actually go after you or not, right?
Interesting.
So if you really want to enter this space, you're going to need to make some guesses. Now, one of the points you brought up, which is things like making misleading claims, uh, that whether you're operating under a state or a federal law, like, yeah, you can't be going out there and claiming that your treatment is going to like cure somebody's arthritis if you haven't gone all the way through the clinical pipeline. But that
Correct.
is, again, the nuance there is that's incidental to the state level context. That could happen whether you were treating people under Florida's law. It could happen whether you were treating people under federal expanded access, right? That is just an entirely separate thing from the question of actually using a state law. The
Mm.
question is, when we examine the historical record, do we have any examples of someone who was not making misleading claims, not violating manufacturing standards, who was being as federally compliant as possible while using a state law? Do we have any examples of those getting serious warning letters or escalating up to enforcement? And the answer is no. It's been 12 years of these state laws going on. It's been like a dozen years. And at our meeting with the FDA, we asked them, and according to their own records, no, it has not ever actually escalated to a court case.
Solid
If
point.
there's even been some warning letters, we couldn't find them.
Okay. Thanks for that. Now that's clear.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. That makes sense.
So, with that said, here is what we did get from FDA. And this is perhaps the most clarity you're going to get in the near future, absent some of the stuff we're talking about with HHS, which I'll get into in a second. What we did get from them was confirmation that it is possible to compliantly use a state and federal law in conjunction at the same time. So we had a cancer case, and we wanted to treat him in New Hampshire, actually, under a law called HB 701. And we asked the FDA, how can we do so? We didn't ask them about their stance on state laws. We asked them, we want to treat this patient under this state law. How can we do so? And what we got back was this explanation of how to use the federal right to try. Now, they did not actually acknowledge the fact that the question was about a state law. They just basically said this little quote of text here. But if you look at this part where it says, provided eligible investigational drugs provided to eligible patients are exempt from several requirements in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, right? Anyone who manufactures, distributes, prescribes, dispenses, introduces, or delivers for introduction into interstate commerce or provides to an eligible patient an eligible investigational drug under the Right to Try Act complies with certain labeling, promotion, and charging requirements. Now, if you read between the lines here, and again, you're going to have to do a lot of reading between the lines when you're engaging with this particular subject matter. What that
Mm-hmm.
meant to us, and what we have gone ahead and actually done, is we have treated a patient for cancer under a state law, or I think will soon. That is happening maybe like in the next financial quarter. And at the same time, we are going to be reporting that under the Federal Right to Try Act. So it is possible for us to use the reporting standard of the Federal Right to Try in conjunction with the state law. Now, for stem cells, that is a little bit more difficult because, as I mentioned earlier, the federal right to try is for life-threatening illnesses only. So if you
Hmm.
were to have a patient who had been diagnosed with like Parkinson's or ALS or something like that, and then you wanted to give them a post phase one stem cell treatment under Florida law, you have a compliant pathway to do so by using the Florida law for the actual administration layer and then reporting that under federal right to try. This is, as far as we can tell, and again, it's FDA is kind of being cagey about the whole thing, but this seems to be what the FDA actually wants you to do in that scenario, right?
Hmm.
Now, for the stem cell stuff specifically, this is something where maybe expanded access might be more useful because, as I mentioned earlier, federal expanded access does not have that life threatening illness requirement. So you might be able to see things like arthritis. You might be able to see things like, I don't know, sports injuries or something like that. If you can get an expanded access program greenlit on the federal level, there is nothing to stop you from utilizing the state law, the Florida law, to actually administer that on the state level. So you would have this kind of like 1-2 punch of we are first going to get our program greenlit federally, and then we are going to do the actual administration under the state level program because it's just simpler and easier, right?
Yeah.
This is right now the closest thing to a compliant pathway to state level participation that has ever been given by the FDA in over 12 years of asking them for it.
Hmm. You know, there's various differences between the right to try, federal right to try, and expanded access. And one of them, for specifically for the expanded access, is you need to have the patient needs to have a severe or immediate life-threatening or a serious disease, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they don't have to have a life-threatening disease, but it's a serious disease. So meaning, like, let's say if I have really bad arthritis and I can't go work, because then I can't go to work. I'm not going to make money. I can't support my family. Would that be a serious disease or a serious condition in the FDA eyes?
So I can give you a historical example here. There was a stem cell company called Mesoblast, which does
Okay.
treatments for degenerative disc disease. They had an expanded access program on a federal level. Now they
Mm,
discontinued it for financial reasons. They were just losing too much
mm,
money doing it.
mm,
But
mm.
that is an example of someone with just an issue that is going to lead to reduced mobility. It's going to lead to
Yep.
like daily chronic pain.
Hmm.
Probably my guess is if you were to look at like actuarial tables, there's probably like lowered survivability on a long-term rate from having
Yeah.
like serious
Interesting.
degenerative disc disease. But that's not in any sense like immediately terminal or life-threatening. You're
Yeah.
not going to die in the next 6 months because you
Yeah.
busted your L5S1, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what I can tell you is generally the FDA's standard towards expanded access is pretty flexible. With
Hmm.
federal right to try, it's funny, you don't actually have to be treating the life threatening illness under federal right to try, but your patient does have to be diagnosed with the life threatening illness. So you can have a cancer patient under federal right to try who wants to use federal right to try to access like a pain medicine. That's totally fine. But they do have to have been diagnosed with something life threatening. Expanded access is a lot more flexible. You'll see it for chronic pain things. You'll see it for arthritis. You'll see it for maybe even like
Interesting.
sports
But
injuries. I've even seen it for like skin creams and stuff. So
wow.
it is a lot more flexible. And for most stem cell companies, that's probably the easier way to go. The
Yeah.
exception would be if you are treating patients who are also diagnosed with like Parkinson's, ALS, something that is
Hmm.
credibly life threatening, right? Then it's probably easier to use the federal right to try.
Yeah. Um. From your knowledge, is there any organization that is helping providers get access or help them through the process that you know of?
Well, I think we were the first ones who discovered this, and it was only like a month ago. So I think Infinita is probably the only
Okay.
organization that can do that right now. You should reach out to me on Twitter. I'm Right to Try Guy, or you can go to our website infinita.city. We don't right now have a bunch of stuff set up for stem cell consulting, but
Okay.
maybe we should. Maybe that's our next offering.
Yeah. We'll have to talk. Okay. Sounds good. Awesome. Great. Good. Good to know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So let me just look at the rest of this deck. Now, the last thing that I want to maybe go over before we just go to like a more flexible Q&A thing. Separately from everything that we're talking about here, which is what we currently have from FDA and HHS, right? There is also a program that is being considered by HHS, and we were one of the co-authors of that program. It's called QSTAR, which stands for Qualified State Therapeutics Access Regime, right? This is making its way through the federal regulatory system. Now, politics is uncertain outcomes on uncertain timelines. So I could not tell you if this is going to pass. And even if I couldn't tell you when it's going to pass. But I can tell you what it does.
Yeah.
It instructs FDA and HHS to issue official guidelines on when it would be appropriate for FDA to exercise enforcement discretion officially, as in saying, okay, you want to go to use a state program. Here is when we won't come after you, just strictly under the letter of federal regulations. And also how providers should do things like notifying FDA or HHS, reporting adverse events, things like that. So if we get this through HHS, then what you will see is that at some point, about 90 days after that gets adopted, there will be not a situation where you have to read between the lines like we currently do, or where you have to utilize a federal system in conjunction with a state level system, but there will be an official pathway to, in a federally compliant fashion, use all of these state laws to some degree or another, while reporting things like your results and adverse events to the FDA. So if that happens, overnight, a lot of these state laws will go from being something that is nice on paper but not really usable, or something that is usable but exists in this legal gray area, to something where you can actually go in there and have regulatory certainty and clarity on the ability to use these laws and how to use them.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this is the QSTAR. Is this something that Infinita is? Infinita? How do you how do you pronounce it?
Infinita. Yeah.
Infinita. Okay, so I'll
Yeah.
say it with the Spanish accent then.
They
Infinita.
are down in Honduras. So.
I'm from Nicaragua, so you guys are right next door.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, so you guys are so QSTAR. So you Infinita is pushing QSTAR.
We're one of. So the
Okay.
way that these things get written, it's never like a solo effort, right? This has been the case with
Yeah.
all the legislation we've done, all the regulatory reforms that we've done. In this case, we had stakeholders from New Hampshire. We had some people who were like stem cell operators down in Florida. Consulted with some guys in Montana. We were one of the voices, and I think that when it came to actually like starting to build momentum on the Hill, so going to representatives in the House, going to senators and things like that, and telling them about the importance of this, I think we were probably the primary voice. But we were not by any sense the sole authors of this. And then also something to keep in mind is the way that this process works. You give somebody at HHS your suggested directive, and from there it's almost out of your hands, right? They're going to take it and they're going to run it by their lawyers. It's going to go in front of the White House's lawyers. I know that OGC at the White House has already looked this over. And then by the time it gets back to, someone like RFK's desk for signature, it's going to be very different. We have some transparency into that process as like the listed stakeholders. But there does come a point where it just becomes more of like horse trading between the actual like bureaucrats and decision makers. And while we're occasionally consulted and asked for advice, we're sort of sidelined. So that's where it's at right now. It is making its way through the system. We have some transparency into what that final structure is going to look like, but it has now kind of past the point where the private stakeholders like us are controlling the language.
Nice. So is QSTAR like an adjunction to state right to try? Is it another different program? How does that work with right to try?
So it's structured as a directive from HHS to the FDA. So basically RFK or whoever, is the signatory at HHS uses their authority over FDA to instruct FDA to issue guidance. And then FDA has something like a 90-day period to look at these issues. They are given a number of principles that they need to consider by HHS. And then FDA must issue guidance basically explaining how to use any of these state laws, including the right to try laws, but also including the Florida stem cell laws, right, in a compliant fashion. And we strongly pushed for an interim policy, which is focused on continuity of care. So, not interrupting people who are currently getting treatments in Florida or currently getting treatments under a right to try or right to individualized treatment law as well. Like, that's for us probably the number one ask. But we'll see if it makes its way into the final. But yeah, that's the structure of it. This is not something that's going to go through Congress. It's not something that has to go through state legislatures. It's basically HHS saying to FDA, you can't ignore this issue anymore. You can't be silent on it. You can't not issue guidance one way or the other. You do have to officially clarify your stance here. And you have to do so in the next 90 days.
Interesting. Do you think that the Chevron deference played a big role in the authority of of us and the FDA?
You know, it's interesting. I've had this conversation with a few people in Congress.
Yeah.
There was one guy, I can't remember which representative, but a guy from South Carolina who really grilled me on that. And you can look at it that way, but I think that the far more like relevant factor is just the political reality of a federal agency going after someone using a state law. Like, look, if you work at the FDA, you are a member of what is probably the single most unpopular bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. already. Like,
Yeah.
you go to these senators' offices, you go to these House reps' offices, you mention the FDA, and it's just like a chorus of groans, right? It's just like, oh, these guys again, right? Like, I just had
You're
somebody visit me last week who has cancer who says they're getting blocked by the FDA, and I can't get a straight answer out of them, right? So these guys are already unpopular. Their funding has to be voted on by Congress every few years. Their leadership has to be voted in. They are, not, and for these people whose job is somewhat tenuous as it is, and maybe even to some extent where the existence of their bureaucracy continuing is not a certain prospect, they have to consider, okay, if I go do this particular thing, is that going to get me in hot water with Congress the next time our funding is being voted on? Right. And they're
uh,
not just thinking of this as an organization, they're also thinking of this as individuals. Am
yeah.
I going to come under scrutiny from the Help Committee or from the Energy and Commerce Committee? Right. Am I going to be on the chopping block? Now, if you're in that situation and you're presented with a bunch of enforcement priorities that you can choose between because you have limited resources, you can't go after everything, right?
Yeah.
Are you going to pick the one that is, oh, I'm going to go into Florida and I'm going to say, yeah, you know what our priority is? We're not going to crack down on like peptides coming out of China. We're going to instead go to Florida and arrest some doctor who was using a state law to treat like an 80-year-old lady's arthritis, right? Well, if you do that, Senator Moody, who sits on the Help Committee, and Senator Scott, who sits on the Aging Committee, they might have a thing or two to say about that the next time that your funding is being voted on, right? And it might not just be the FDA that's under the gun. It might be you individually as the person who signed off on that letter, right?
Hmm.
So the
Interesting.
easiest thing for you to do is nothing. It's not to say, okay, we're going to let this go. It's also not to say we're going to go after this. It's just to kind of pretend it doesn't exist and focus your energy elsewhere. And that's what we have
Hmm.
basically seen out of them for the last 12 years. Now, you can say that there's things like Chevron, which are factoring into this, but I really don't think that anyone at the FDA who is making these decisions about enforcement priorities is actually doing that sophisticated of an analysis. I think that the first instinct is just like, oh, I don't want to touch that. And that's the way that the decision is actually being made.
Hmm. Why do you think they don't want to touch that? Resources, they just don't want to get scrutinized, like what you mentioned.
It's a
Yeah.
combination of those. They did confirm in our meeting, by the way. They did confirm,
Hmm.
like, yeah, we have limited resources, we have limited staff and bandwidth and man hours. We get to choose where we prioritize our enforcement, right? And historically, we have not prioritized going after people using these state laws. Now, why they do so, no, they're never going to say. But my personal hot take on it is just that every single person who is considering it is like, dude, I'm going to get in so much trouble if I do this. Like, I don't want to touch this.
Yeah. Well, that right there is the same reason why many doctors, many providers don't touch stem cells, right? They don't touch
Yeah.
biologics because there's very unclear. There's not much clarity on what they can or cannot do, and they're all afraid of losing their license. And they worked what 12 years plus, right, to become a doctor, a physician, and I don't blame them. So having these type of programs, clarity in organizations, what you're doing is phenomenal for patient access, for providers, and to help society and even move medicine forward, right?
Yeah, and our hope, listen, if QSTAR passes, I think you're going to see that it's going to become overnight a lot easier for even like very risk sensitive providers. And I don't only mean
Mm.
doctors, I also mean manufacturers and biotechs, which is where I mostly focus.
That's
It's going to be
that's
a
true
lot
too.
easier for them to justify going into one of these state level programs, right? And my hope is that that's really going to revolutionize also the investment into drug development in the United States. Because if you have the ability to use these state level programs to get data, that changes the game for taking a drug through the clinical pipeline. The end goal here is not that someone is going to come to Florida and that's it. They're just never going to go somewhere else. The end goal is that you're going to see companies in Florida who are using this to get data to support their clinical trial results so that they can take their drug nationwide, right? Because they can do so without breaking the bank, without going bankrupt.
Yep.
But in order to do that, we have to have some guidance here. What we do have after months of effort is that dual pathway, right? So we have this. You can use expanded access or right to try in conjunction with a
Nice.
state law like Florida's. What we're trying to get is QSTAR, which is where you don't even need to do this. But for right now, if you are a provider or you're a biotech or you're a manufacturer and you have a post phase one treatment, so you just have that initial human safety data, you do have viable options for using the state law. You just have to pair it with a federal pathway like expanded access or right to try.
Interesting. Yeah. I know one of the previous podcast that you did the interview, there was something that, and you kind of briefly touched it, that since we're on the topic of manufacturers, right, and using post phase one trials, right, you mentioned something to where the manufacturers and by these biotech companies, they're not incentivized to actually provide access or these drugs to
Yeah.
to providers, right? Because there's no incentives. There's actually higher risks. And when I
Hmm.
heard you say that, I was like, that makes total sense. Because when I started learning and researching on all the compassionate use, right to try, I started talking about it. And I'm like, why are doctors, providers not using it as like they should, And I never really understood why. I never really got into a good conversation with a provider to really understand why until your interview. When I heard that, I was like, that makes total sense. Why would a manufacturer want to risk their whole, pipeline, their business when they're not incentivizing? So that right there, man, you hit that on the money.
Yeah. So let me see if I can find. I got to figure out what Claude did and didn't do here. Yeah, here we go. Um, so let's maybe just segue briefly to like the incentives of pre-approval access generally. Right now,
Okay.
there's a difference here between if you're planning on going through the clinical pipeline or not. Right.
Okay.
This is what you see with a lot of stuff in Florida is that there's not really that much of a plan to go through the clinical pipeline. This won't apply to that so much. But the kind of treatments that we usually focus on, they have a plan to eventually go for full FDA approval. And so the question is for a company in that position, let's say a company doing stem cell treatments, what does it look like for them to use pre approval access at all, whether it's through a state level or whether it's through a federal level? Well, the equation for these companies always is going to boil down to risk reward. That's how you decide everything in business, right? You can't be going out there and just doing stuff out of the goodness of your heart. That's a really easy way to go bankrupt. You have to be able to justify it on a spreadsheet. Now,
Yeah.
what are the risks and rewards for pre-approval access under a federal level? Under a federal level, you have to price at cost. And I won't go into the nuances here, but the reality of that means you're going to lose money every time you treat a patient, right? And then on top of that, you have risks. You have regulatory risk, like there's a rumor that FDA might not like it when you provide pre-approval access. I kind of think that's bullshit, but it is
Yeah.
out there. It is a
Yeah.
non-zero risk. So you have to factor that in. There's the risk of a lawsuit. Even if you're going to win the lawsuit, the cost of fighting it will be tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you might lose. So that's another risk that has to be piled on. The real risk, the
Yeah.
things that like is the actual, when I've talked to biotechs, the most relevant factor is the reputational risk or bad PR. Let's say that you treat somebody in
Mm,
a right to try context and then they have an adverse event, which by the way, in right to try context is like very possible. You're often treating people who are just at the end of their rope, right? So things
yep.
might go badly, even if your treatment works spectacularly, just because their situation was that bad. Well, if some journalist finds out about that and writes a negative story, even if 6 months later the investigation shows that it had nothing to do with your treatment, just the presence of that headline, right, can do immense damage to you. The next time you're out raising funds, some investor is going to Google you. That's going to be the first thing that comes up, and you're not going to be able to put together your Series A or your Series B, right? All of this is the risk, and all of this has to be weighed against the reward. So, what is the
Yep.
reward for providing pre approval access under a federal system, right to try or expanded access? Basically nothing. Basically nothing at all. All right. You're going to lose money every time you treat a patient. So actually, it's like negative reward for your money. And then
Yep.
theoretically, you're supposed to be able to get this data, and that's going to help you get faster approvals or pitch investors. But in reality, there's not enough clarity on how to use real world evidence and the value of that data because sizes are so small and it doesn't take place in a clinical trial context. The value of that data is just not that high. It's not
Mm,
worthless, but it's not enough by itself to outweigh
yeah.
all of these risks and all of the money that you're going to lose. And so the end result is that these federal systems, which don't allow for companies to price at a profit so that that monetary reward can outweigh these risks, they just have next to no adoption. And it's because often when you talk to these companies and you say like, "Hey, why aren't you using this?" Their answer is like, "Listen, I would love to help these people, but if I try to do this, my like board is going to crucify me or I won't be able to raise my next round." So this is why you see that the state of pre-approval access in America is so poor. We have all these laws where you should technically have a right to try, but then you go try to actually use them and there's just practically nothing available. And I can speak to this with the stem cell stuff, by the way, from personal experience.
Yeah, of course.
The
Go
way
ahead.
that I got started in all of this, I injured my spine. And I wanted to access treatments from either a company called Discgenics or
Okay.
Mesoblast. Discgenics is located in Salt Lake City. And this was years ago. This was before I started researching all this stuff. I naively thought, oh, well, I've got right to try. I've got expanded access. These guys are located in Utah where there's this new stem cell law. Surely I will be able to get a hold of this treatment somehow, right? Maybe I can avoid
Mm,
surgery.
yeah.
Nope. Couldn't do it. They have no expanded access. They have no right to try. They are not willing to use the state law. So I talked to Mesoblast. Instead, I actually got all the way up to some of their C-level people, and they had an expanded access program on the federal level and then discontinued it. And I asked why. Like, why are you getting rid of this thing? Like, this would have been great for me to access
Yeah.
your
Of
treatment.
course.
And they're not like evil people. They're not like
Yeah.
villains who are just like, I love making medicine and not giving it to people. This is my favorite, right? They were people who had to run a company. They had a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders.
Yep.
And they were saying, listen, man, like we were just losing enormous sums of money on this expanded access program. We were doing the right thing and the market was punishing us for it. We were taking all this risk, and every single time that we treated a patient, we were losing money. And then this like data, which was supposed to be so valuable and outweigh all of this, was basically useless.
Hmm.
So this is where the state level programs that do allow for pricing at a profit can come in and fix this skewed risk reward system. It's not something that the FDA or people in Washington, D.C. like, but you can show like clear, unambiguous data that this is necessary if you want pre approval access to actually function.
Yeah. Yeah, because they at the end of the day, they need to satisfy, they need to make money at the end of the day, because if there's no money, then there's no can't pay rent to their laboratory, they can't pay their scientists, they can't pay for equipment, maintenance, keep on the lights, right? So,
And
and it's
none of that is deductible under the federal system.
what?
Yep. G&A, CMC, all of these things. Under the federal system, you are very limited in what you're allowed to deduct when you're doing pre-approval access. And it's basically just the manufacturing on cost on a per unit basis of that drug. So literally what you are going to pay the manufacturer each dose. That's basically what you're allowed to get back. Anything other than that, you just can't get it back.
There's really no incentives then at all, like you mentioned.
It's not even like there's no incentives. It's almost like if you do this, it's just a guaranteed way to lose money. If a company was
Yeah,
to really go whole hog on pre approval access in the
yeah,
United States, unless they were sitting on an enormous pile of cash, it's a recipe
yeah.
to go bankrupt.
So is QSTAR a solution to this problem?
Yes. So under QSTAR, the FDA and HHS are going to basically say, all right, here is how you can compliantly participate in these state level programs. Now, state level programs like Montana's, state level programs like Florida's, right, or Utah's, or even New Hampshire's under HB 701. These all allow for providers to price at a profit. So if you had the FDA and HHS saying, okay, you can go use these laws as they are written, here's how you need to report to us, but so long as you're obeying the state law, it's kind of like state level
Hmm.
cannabis law, we're not going to come after you. Then you would have providers say, oh, okay, we maybe can't do federal right to try. We can't do federal expanded access because the at cost pricing definition is too strict and we would lose money. But if we go to
Yeah.
Florida, we go to Montana, if we go to New Hampshire or Utah, or maybe like Wyoming or something like that, we have flexibility. We can price it enough that we could actually break even. And that way we can scalably provide all of this treatment pre approval access. And maybe, and here's the moonshot, maybe we can actually do so to a wide enough group of patients that even though that data as like individual data points is not valuable, maybe we can get so much of it that we can actually start to make a case here for
Hmm.
using this to supplement our clinical trial results, which is how the FDA system is supposed to work. So maybe under QSTAR that will actually be possible because generating enough of that real world evidence to be clinically significant actually becomes economically possible.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, they'll be able to keep their lights on, innovation, they'll be able to hire more scientists, be able to
Yeah.
be well funded, not lose money.
Yeah. And there's on the data side, there's some interesting things that we've seen with the companies who want to use these state programs who are in
Okay.
between clinical trials. So when you have
Okay.
a clinical trial for a phase 2 or phase 3, which is where you're supposed to begin to show efficacy, right? Phase 1 is
Mhm.
you show safety, but you don't make any claims about like, here's what we're going to measure to show this stuff works. You're just showing that it's not going to like destroy somebody's liver or something like that, right?
Mhm.
Phase 2 and 3 is where you start to show, okay, we're going to claim that this treats the following disease. We call it an indication. And we're going to claim it does so by measuring this in the human body, right? Uh, we have companies that are not yet starting their phase 2 or phase 3, and they're just kind of unsure what to measure in their next clinical trial to like show efficacy. A
Mm.
lot of what's attractive to those companies is the idea that they could come to Montana or they could come to Florida and they could treat these patients and then they could track a whole bunch of different biomarkers and metrics, right? And they can look at what is improving as the patients improve. And that way, when they go to their next phase of clinical trial, they can say, okay, we have all of this data from Florida, and maybe we can't use it with the FDA, but we do know from our own records that when we do our next trial with the FDA, we should use this as our endpoint, which we're measuring. We should be measuring this and arguing that it shows efficacy in this, right? So this is
Yeah.
just one of the ways that real world evidence can be useful for companies that are going through the clinical pipeline and are between trials. And it seems
Yeah.
to be one of the most attractive value propositions of these state level programs.
Yeah. When you say companies, right? Do you mean manufacturers that they go to Montana? Is that what you mean by manufacturers?
Well, there's a separation between manufacturers and biotechs, right? Or the
Okay.
FDA regulatory language would be like sponsors. So
Okay.
the manufacturer may or may not be a sponsor themselves. It's not
Okay.
required, right? But the sponsor is the entity that is responsible for an ongoing clinical pipeline, right? They're the ones who actually file things with
I
the
see what you're
FDA.
saying.
They might own the IP behind the rights, but they might, or the behind the treatment, but they might, contract the manufacturing out. They also might themselves just be the manufacturer. There's no requirement that it's separate.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Yeah, because I know that I don't know the nuances or like the accurate information, but I know that when I was researching, if for whatever, let's say for example, there's a manufacturer that's manufacturing, let's say stem cells in Florida, it's illegal to ship it to, let's say, another state commerce to sell
Yes.
for profit, right?
Hmm.
Um, So how would, let's say, a biotech or manufacturer, is that a problem with QSTAR, or like does the manufacturer have to go to Montana? Like how is that, how does that work?
Yeah, so there's two answers to that question. One is under
Yeah.
what we have currently, and then one is under QSTAR. Under QSTAR,
Okay.
the simple answer is it's not a problem. The
Doesn't
simple
matter.
answer
You can
is
ship anywhere, state lines, all that stuff. That's good.
there will be notification processes. You will have to keep the FDA in the loop and tell them, hey, we're doing this, we're doing that. Here's how we're going to meet your quality standards. Here's how we're going to meet your track and trace standards, right? There will be those requirements, but there will not be some carte blanche, uh, you know, refusal to allow you to ship for use under another state law. So that's the post Q Star world, right? In
Gotcha.
the meantime, if we go back to what we do have from the FDA, which is this thing where you need to read between the lines, under federal
Hmm.
right to try and expanded access, you can already ship interstate. This is already a thing that is allowed, right? So if
Hmm.
you have these programs going, there is nothing to stop you from using federal right to try, using expanded access, and then shipping product from Florida to Montana or vice versa, right? For use under the state law, so long
Hmm.
as you are also using one of these federal programs.
Okay, got it. So you have to be, that makes sense, right? Using one of the
Yeah.
programs, the pathways. Okay.
You're basically using the federal program as I don't know, like you could think of it as as like a step ladder to reach the state program in a compliant fashion.
Yeah.
So you can ship interstate. You will not get a hassle from the FDA. It's going to be a little bit more of a compliance burden. Like there's going to be basically double layers of reporting, right? Which is annoying, but
Yeah.
it is ultimately possible to do. You can use this and you can go to Florida and treat patients compliantly. You can go to Montana and treat patients compliantly. You can ship products between states or the components for those products for final assembly in the states. So long as you can do so under both of these programs at once, it can be done in a compliant fashion.
Nice. Yeah. The way that I see compliance and these regulatory, I see them as, something that is, it's needed, and I don't see it as a burden or an obstacle. It's just an advantage, like at the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about clarity, right? If we have clarity, if we know what we can or cannot say or cannot do, then, we know the compliance side of things, then we're going to, um, go through that process in a compliant way, right? So like a lot of people, and I get it, right? Most of the people that see compliance as an obstacle they may not understand these nuances and understand it, so they do see it as an obstacle. You know,
Well, to be fair, listen, it's not easy to come to an understanding
it's
of
not.
this when the
It's not.
agency you're supposed to be compliant with kind of refuses to give answers directly, right?
It's true.
I mean, everything that we're talking about here, it was not easy to get even this out of FDA. This one paragraph is essentially the fruits of 6 months of having like congressmen and House representatives like yell at the FDA on our behalf and then like going into like a high pressure meeting with like department heads and stuff, right? And
Yeah,
still
well,
we
that's
only
true.
got like this kind of vague half answer, right?
Yeah,
So
that's true.
you have
Yeah,
to accept that because of the politically toxic nature of this issue, they're just super hesitant to do or say anything. And that puts you in a
yeah,
real pickle when it's time to comply, but I think we have enough now that between the historical record and the little text that we do have, you can piece together some compliance answers that even just 2 months ago were not really possible to know.
yeah. In one of your slides, you have the difference between Florida and Utah. Can you
Yeah.
go over it a little bit? Because the
Right.
reason why I'm asking for that is because obviously in Florida they have SB 1768, which is the stem cell bill. I'm not sure if
Hmm.
this is the one that you are referring to, and then obviously Utah.
Yeah.
A lot of people, we're in Florida, and a lot of people still don't know much about what you can do in Florida, which drives me crazy. It's wild that a lot of providers don't know that.
Well, let's consider it your information asymmetry, right? If you know it and
Yeah.
other people don't, that's great for you. So yeah, look, I come at all of this from a different perspective than maybe the average Florida or Utah participant, right? I come at it from the
Okay.
perspective of what do companies who are going through the clinical pipeline think? And I will tell
Okay.
you that they tend to prefer Florida's law. And the reason
Over
counterintuitive
Utah.
over Utah. And the
Okay.
reason counterintuitively is that Florida is a little bit more highly regulated. They actually want that.
Okay.
Because for companies who are planning on continuing to engage with the FDA or try to go for full approval, even with the gray area that these state laws exist in, they're thinking of this as like, what is more credible? What, when we take this data to the FDA or when we take our evidence that we did try our best to be compliant in an uncertain area, what is going to make the most credible case? Florida, where the sources have to be like federally accredited when you're sourcing the stem
Hmm.
cells, when there is GMP manufacturing requirements, right?
Hmm.
When there is testing on each unit, when there is like actual real chain of custody and track and trace and things like that. We had a panel in Washington, D.C. recently with a biotech. It's the same one that actually came to the meeting with the FDA that is already up and
Okay.
running in Florida. And I asked them, like, okay, you're post phase one, you're going for full approval. Why did you choose Florida over Utah when Utah is so much easier? And the answer was, we chose Florida over Utah because Utah is so much easier, right? We don't want it to necessarily be perfectly easy. We want it to be highly, highly credible. And we want every patient and every regulator who looks at us to, at first glance, know for me to get this stuff, it had to go through a real serious testing regimen. It had to be appropriately quality controlled and tracked and traced and everything like that. And this is relevant for two reasons. One, it's for the company. This is going to dictate what kind of providers you attract. I'll tell you, I don't think you're going to see a lot of like companies who have real clinical data behind their treatments going to Utah because they kind of went a little too laissez faire with it, right? Whereas Florida is an attractive process. And
Makes sense.
second, whether it's QSTAR or whether it's just what we have today, I'll tell you that I think regulators are going to look at Florida's stem cell law, regulators from a federal level, a lot more favorably than they're going to
Hmm.
look at Utah's law. Because again, there's just that first glance factor of knowing that there was a real process you had to go through to get into a clinic in Florida. Whereas to get into Utah, it's kind of just like some doctor like slaps a notice on the wall and all of a sudden you can kind of get up and going. Like the FDA is not going to take kindly to that. Now,
Yeah.
how much that's going to matter for like getting a court case thrown at you? Probably not a lot. But if you're a company that's planning on engaging with the FDA and convincing them to approve your next phase of clinical trials, that might matter a lot.
Of course. Yeah, I'm glad you said that because I did look at Florida and Utah, and Florida did have some really good guardrails like what you have here. So
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear
There's
that from
times
someone
where
that
you
has
might
been.
want to opt into a higher compliance burden because it's just going to put you on better footing for both the value of your data that you generate and
Yep.
also for dealing with federal regulators.
Yep. I mean, you choose hard now to then be easy later. If you choose easy now, it's going to become harder later.
Exactly.
That was a smart move by whoever the director was from that company.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm like okay to say who they are, so I'll keep it kind of vague. But I'll tell you that
Oh,
they
no.
are post phase two, so they've already got some initial clinical trial efficacy data. They're already treating patients overseas, and they are getting up and running in Florida now. And they made the conscious decision to go to Florida over Utah. It was not some like idle thing. It was something where they all sat down and they considered lots of factors. And I'm sure that population density was also a factor, but ultimately
Yeah,
the structure
sure.
of the regulation mattered.
I agree with that. Because now if you have certain rules, right, certain guardrails in place, as a doctor, right? Well, I'm not a doctor, but a provider would look at that. It was like, wow, like I actually have a state that has these instructions. Like it has to be, good manufacturing process, current good manufacturing process, right? It has to have a viability report, like, has to be accredited by three organizations. Like that kind of, as a provider, that'll make me at ease. And even as a patient, right? Because I know that there's like certain things and criteria that has to be met. So, and then there's also marketing language. Yeah, that I think Florida is a pretty, I think, not because I'm in Florida, but I think it's probably one of the best stem cell laws, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Although we'll see. I think Wyoming just passed something, so I guess we'll have to see how they do. But
Interesting. Interesting. Okay,
yeah.
cool. So,
Just so you know, I got
you,
to wrap up in about 5 minutes.
okay, you're good. So, is there anything else that you want to just close out then, or
As
anything
I
else you want
close
to
it,
say?
I think the last thing that I'd say is like, listen, we deal with a lot of stuff in my work that is very cutting edge, and that even people who have been in this space like 10 years won't necessarily have a handle on. This is my
I
contact
agree.
info here. I'm very active also on X or Twitter. So if you have any questions about any of this, if you're going through the clinical pipeline and you want to know more about how to use one of these state laws, or if you're a stem cell provider and you're already up and running in Florida and you'd like to explore how to position yourself to take your treatment through the clinical pipeline, please reach out to us.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Steve, thank you so much for being here and spending about an hour and 15 minutes with us. I know many providers will find this super valuable, and even manufacturers, like you said, a lot of manufacturers, they're kind of lost, and they don't really understand it. Even the providers. So I'm glad you're bringing clarity to the space regarding stem cells, unapproved, experimental. And I am really interested in collaborating with you and seeing, how we can work together. And even if anyone else is interested in working with you, you're doing great work, man. Keep up. Keep up the good work.
All right. Thanks very much, and I hope you have a good weekend.
All righty. Adios.